entre Brasil y Colombia. Yo creo que hay que contar con cómo lograr de ese pueblo de Chile. Quiere gente a tu país y a tu gente le vaya bien.
Que se crean entre los cubanos en el exterior
Educación, interés al mundo. Hola amigos, hola amigas, estamos en una nueva edición de nuestro programa Conversaciones Americanas. Para comenzar, quiero hablarles del tema que vamos a tratar hoy. Es una entrevista que hacemos a Mary Harper, que es la editora para África de la BBC, la principal radio internacional de Gran Bretaña y reconocida experta en temas de Somalia y del Cuerno de África. Es una de las personas, por ejemplo, de las pocas periodistas que se dice que tiene comunicación directa, ha tenido comunicación directa con el grupo terrorista Al-Shabaab de Somalia y que ha tenido que ver con el secuestro de los dos médicos cubanos desde abril del 2019. Estoy refiriéndome a una persona que podemos considerar por sus credenciales, graduada de la Universidad de Cambridge, con más de 20 años en el estudio de la región, que nos puede ilustrar, iluminar acerca de el tema de la situación en Somalia, el norte de Kenia, el grupo Al-Shabaab en particular. Bueno, quiero agradecer que con nosotros está Eric López, que ya nos hizo la primera contribución al programa, y está también el amigo Ronald desde Madrid, que debe estar bastante tarde allá y nos dice saludos cordiales desde Madrid, profesor Levi. Y bueno, Eric López, que nos hizo varios comentarios, saludos para usted y su familia, buenas tardes Arturo, y nos hizo esta comunicación, esta donación de $2, $1.99. Le agradecemos mucho esto. Yo he estado tratando de hacer un programa en la semana pasada o esta semana que ahora termina, pero de verdad que he estado con una gripe muy fuerte. Le hicimos la entrevista a Mary Harper porque teníamos el tiempo específico, era muy difícil que pudiéramos coordinar para otra hora y por eso se la hicimos. Ustedes podrán ver que yo estoy bajo el fuerte impacto de la gripe. Quería eh, hacerle esta pequeña introducción antes de poner la entrevista, porque la entrevista, aunque es en inglés, la hemos hecho una traducción en español que básicamente ha sido a través de un procedimiento de inteligencia artificial, por lo cual la traducción tiene algún que otro defecto, pero hemos decidido hacerlo así porque tenemos un público que es fundamentalmente de habla hispana y queremos que sea una posibilidad de llegar, lo vamos a transmitir solo en inglés y este lo vamos a transmitir ahora en el programa ahora con esta introducción. Hay algunas cuestiones en las cuales ustedes verán que la traducción se hace un poco difícil porque el orden de las cosas, por ejemplo, a veces cuando usa mi pronunciación, hay un instituto del cual Mary es becaria, que se llama el Rift Institute, que se escribiría R-I-F-T o R-I-F-T en inglés. Y desafortunadamente cuando yo hablo, la traductora lo traduce como RIF, como R-E-E-V-E, pero eso yo creo que no debe ser un obstáculo para transmitir la transmisión. Hipotéticamente se podría haber corregido la traducción de inteligencia artificial, pero para mí se convertía en un grandísimo problema. Como ustedes saben, este programa no cuenta con ningún presupuesto, es a partir de lo que hacen de donaciones los miembros, de lo que contribuyen las personas con un super chat. Otro llamado a hacerlo, si usted puede, comparta el programa, porque mientras más usted lo comparta, los algoritmos de YouTube lo presentan a otras personas. Y de verdad yo creo que es algo que sale como excepcional, en mi opinión, en el contexto de la conversación que hay sobre la suerte de los médicos, el grupo Al-Shabaab, etcétera. Entonces, yo no quiero dilatarlo más. Le quiero pedir a ustedes que si pueden regálennos el like. Ahora mismo los que están conectados den like. Los que puedan compártelo en Facebook, compártelo en X. Está saliendo también por Instagram. Así que también por ahí lo puede compartir y ponga atención a las cosas que se dicen aquí. Usted podrá oírlo o leerlo, oírlo en inglés, leerlo en español, porque están los subtítulos y fíjese ese esfuerzo que hacemos y en la medida que usted pueda, contribuya al mismo. Entonces, yo lo voy a compartir ya y se los dejo hasta el final. Si hay un tiempito, yo tomaré algunos comentarios y los comentaré del chat o a lo mejor alguien puede subir, no estoy seguro, pero disfrutemos o no quiero decir disfrutemos, contemos con el conocimiento de una persona que realmente sabe de este tema ante tanta charlatanería de personas hablando y discutiendo sobre el tema y dando probabilidades sobre la vida y la muerte de los médicos cubanos o hablando de Al-Shabaab a partir de conocimiento muy superficial. Ha sido un privilegio que Mary Harper, una de las primeras expertas en este tema, haya accedido a darnos, una de las primeras expertas en el mundo de este tema, haya accedido a darnos una entrevista para este modesto espacio que tenemos aquí, que se llama Conversaciones Americanas. Nos vemos, disculpen también mi gripe y que todavía sigo afectado en la voz, pero vamos a mirarlo y miro con gran interés los comentarios que ustedes tienen al respecto. Ya voy.
Crean entre los cubanos y
Hola, hello, my friends. We have the opportunity to have here with us Mary Harper. Mary is the Africa editor of the BBC, and she agreed to talk with us about the situation in Somalia and particularly the organization Al-Shabaab. It's a great pleasure for us, Mary, that you are here with us. Let me introduce the audience a little more about who you are, and please give me some minutes. And also, I would like that if there is something that I say that is not correct or that you would like to add, please feel free to do it. First, she is the BBC editor for Africa, and she's a fellow at the Rift Valley Institute. She has been a researcher for the United Nations, the European Union, and the Heritage Institute policy. And she is the author of 2 books. I have the opportunity to read one of them that is called Everything You Have Told Me Is True, The Many Faces of Al-Shabaab. And also she is the author of another book that has been well acclaimed called Getting Somalia Wrong. She is a graduate from Cambridge University and the School of Oriental and African Studies. She speaks English, French, Portuguese, and Wolof. What a great pleasure, Mary, that you have accepted to be with us. We have, as I told you, we have an audience that is mainly Latin American, but many of them speak English too. So, how are you?
I'm fine, and I'm speaking to you from London, where it's very grey and very rainy, as usual. I recently came back from Somalia, where I spend a lot of my time, and I'd just like to thank you very much for having me. It's an honor. Thank you.
Just last week, I tried to contact Mary since I found the book, and also I listened some of the podcast that she had been speaking, and she was in Somaliland when I contacted her. We were trying to do the interview last week, but it was hard because issues of communication. But it's clear that you are one of the persons that is more connected with the region, and particularly with this country that is so important in the context of what we are going to talk today, that is Somalia. First, one of your books is Getting Somalia Wrong. We Cubans, or people that follow Cuba, we have some impression about the country. The country played a role in the history of Cuban projection abroad. First, there were some Somalis that went to study in Cuba during the period of the alignment of the Mohammed Siad Barre regime with Cuba and the Soviet Union, or Soviet Union and Cuba. And then later we have the conflict for the Ogaden territory in Ethiopia. Now we have the situation that there are a lot of Cubans, some Cuban doctors working in Somalia. So people have interest in Africa. Part of the Cuban population is from Africa origin, not from East, but from West Africa. But we would like to ask you, how do you describe the situation in Somalia today?
It's a very complicated question. And I think if you asked a lot of Western journalists like me, they would give you about 5 words to describe Somalia. They would talk about terrorism, because there are Al-Qaeda and Islamic State linked groups there. They would talk about pirates, because Somalia became very, very famous for piracy some years back in the Indian Ocean. They would talk about drought and floods. They would talk about famine, and they would talk about more than 3 decades of war. And Somalia does have all those things, and piracy has started to return a little bit because they're taking advantage of the situation in the Red Sea with the Houthis. But one reason why I wrote my first book, and I called it Getting Somalia Wrong, was that after I first went there in 1994, so it has been 30 years now, ever since the very beginning when I went there, when it was torn apart by civil war. But there were so many other things that were happening in Somalia, and I wanted to kind of right that wrong, as it were. And as a Western journalist, there was so much pressure on me to always talk about those negative things about Somalia, the stereotypical things, that I hardly ever had the opportunity to talk about their incredible entrepreneurship, their amazing risk-taking, the way that they deal with money, that's all based, a lot of it is based on trust. The way that the clans, Somalia is divided by clans, and they do fight each other, but they also really, really help each other. If you see a Somali in London and then you see another Somali, even if they don't know each other, they do really, really help each other. So the bonds that they have through their shared nationalities are very strong. There are also parts of the territory, like Somaliland, where I was recently, which broke away from Somalia in 1991. And even though it was completely destroyed during the civil war with the government of Siad Barre, who you mentioned, it has built itself up from rubble. It was known as the Dresden of Africa because it was so badly bombed. It was a bit like Dresden in the Second World War in Germany. And that territory, it's not recognized by anyone. It's built itself up into a functioning state with its own army, its own currency, its own economy, its own passports. And often the sort of more positive side of Somalia, Somaliland, and Somalis are completely ignored by, in particular, I would say, Western audiences. And so I wanted to say, okay, there's a lot of things about Somalia that are very challenging, but there are also lots and lots of things that are really incredible and positive.
Well, I'm gonna just add to what you said, is that I lived for a while in Minnesota, particularly in the airport. Most of the workers are Somalis, and you see very hardworking people. And you go to the neighborhood where they live, and there is quite of pride there. You see that they have pictures. They talk a lot when you talk to them about Somalia, and it's a very interesting dynamic that warned me or alert me about not to go for the stereotypes that you just described. Talking about stereotypes, I noticed that in the discussion about Somalia, among many Cubans, there has been several people that has gone to look at Somalia, and particularly the issue of Al-Shabaab as a combination of three movies. And what I have noticed is that they by reading your book, I noticed that there is the vision that is a small country when in reality it's a large country. And probably some of the people are using these stereotypes and don't understanding well what is the situation. These three movies are Captain Phillips, in which somebody, for some reason, have said that it's a group that is connected to piracy. When I look in the map, it looks that most of the piracy will be in the northern part, in the northern shore, while Al-Shabaab is more in the southern part of the country, no, or the southern half. And the other is Black Hawk Down, and it looks that there is not the connection between those who did it originally, Mohammed Farah did, and the group of Al-Shabaab. And then the other one is that I want to ask you about is a British movie that is called Eye in the Sky. And I would like to ask you, sorry, because I noticed that you are a real expert, but if what you will tell the audience about how much those movies are able to reflect the reality on the ground.
Yeah, interestingly, Captain Phillips, even though it was a very sort of American-centered, the American hero, all of that movie, I did a lot of work speaking with pirates. That was really my role. I had a lot of contacts with the pirates, and I also had a lot of contacts with the people who were in the Navy who were trying to fight the pirates. And that film, compared with the other ones, is more accurate. I mean, it's stereotypical, but it's more accurate, and at least it tries to show that the pirates, they, number one, they're humans, and number two, some of them became pirates because so many foreign fishing vessels would come and take all the fish from Somali seas. And so the local fisher people who have very, very small boats and small resources, they got fed up with this. And so some of the pirates actually called themselves coast guards rather than pirates, because they're like, we're protecting our seas, even though they were performing criminal acts. You cannot deny that. What you said about how the pirates are more based in the north and Al-Shabaab in the south, there was a lot of confusion about Al-Shabaab and piracy being closely linked. But in fact, for Al-Shabaab, they saw the pirates as something which is called haram in Islam. It's like, this is something that's totally unacceptable. They're stealing, they're behaving wildly. And in fact, the pirates had their main town in a place called Haradere. And Al-Shabaab, they took over that town. And when they did, the pirates were chased away. So they weren't, you can't really connect the two. Black Hawk Down, like some people say, the people who shot down the helicopters and dragged the Americans naked through the streets, that they had some link with Al-Qaeda, that somehow they were the birthplace of Al-Shabaab. But I mean, I was in Mogadishu during that civil war, and there's always been a history of some Islamist extremism in Somalia, but the fighting that was happening then was to do with clans. It wasn't really to do with religious beliefs. And then Eye in the Sky, once again, very Western sort of focused. They're the heroes, they're the interesting people, as it were. And that's just another film, really. I mean, it has some interesting moral dilemmas, but it doesn't reflect very much to do with Somalis, let's put it that way.
Well, thank you for this enlightening explanation. When you began to describe the situation, you make a reference to clans, and this is an area in which we have seen, you follow the issue of the Cuban doctors that were kidnapped in the South. People talk a lot about two institutions that the Cubans and the Kenyans has tried to mobilize to achieve the release of the doctors. And one is the traditional Council of Elders. I don't know exactly the name but they call it like that, like the Council of Elders, and they talk about a group of Islamic courts. And I noticed that you referred to the issue of the Islamic courts in some of your work, but I am a little confused, to be honest with you, to what point this is the Islamic courts are part of the landscape of Somalia, and to what point there is a group called the Union of Islamic Courts. Is every Islamic court part of what was the Union of Islamic Courts? If you can tell us about that, I will appreciate it.
Sure. So really, the Union of Islamic Courts, that came before Al-Shabaab became this mighty fighting force in Somalia. So during the civil war of the 1990s, which was mainly clan-based, and the people who were in control were known as warlords. They were heads of different clans, powerful figures in different clans. And the country was kind of divided up by clan, by warlords. Then some Sharia, some Islamic courts, they began to introduce some form of justice, some form of order in some parts of the country. And they basically got together in a kind of informal union, and they managed to beat the warlords. They beat them back. And for about 6 months in Somalia, in the second half of 2006, I mean, Somalis, they said that was the ones in the capital, Mogadishu. They said this is the first time since the early 90s that we can go and walk down the streets without being in fear of not coming home because we've been shot or blown up. So they did bring some peace to the country. But then the Americans, basically, they decided that these group of Islamic courts, who were they were traditionally Muslim and they were quite severe, but they were not like incredibly extreme. The Americans decided that they were somehow an Al-Qaeda presence, and they worked with the Ethiopians, and this group of Islamic courts were bombed out of existence by the Ethiopians just after Christmas Day in 2006. And then what happened was this action radicalized the Islamic courts, and they became a much more extreme group, and Al-Shabaab rose to power. Al-Shabaab had been part of the Islamic courts in terms of being sort of the youth guards, but they were not the predominant force. But the destruction of the Islamic courts gave rise to this incredibly successful affiliate of Al-Qaeda that is often described as Al-Qaeda's most successful affiliate, because it took over, most of southern and central Somalia. But in terms of the Union of Islamic Courts now, they're gone. So they don't really feature. And in terms of the Cuban doctors, if there were negotiations to try to get them released, quite often the clan elders are the people that help with these sorts of negotiations, but their authority has been weakened to some extent by the presence of Al-Shabaab, because Al-Shabaab professes that it isn't really interested in clans, even though it is. But clan elders, if you need something negotiated, you go to the respected members of different clans and sub-clans, and they will try to help you sort it out.
So, but let's go now and talk a little about the situation in southern Somalia, the area and northern Kenya, because you have mentioned the issue of Ethiopia. Obviously, there was the intervention with the support of the United States. Then the African Union troops came to replace the Ethiopian troops, but particularly in trying to use the time that you so kindly has given to us, I would like to ask you about the situation in southern Somalia and northern Kenya, where the kidnapping of the Cuban doctors happened.
Sure. I mean, northeastern Kenya, the part of Kenya that borders Somalia, it's populated by ethnic Somalis. So they're Kenyan citizens, but it's really not very helpful to think of them as being separate from the Somalis in Somalia. And if you go to that border area, they're mainly nomadic people, so they're crossing backwards and forwards all the time. I very much doubt half the time they know whether they're in Kenya or Somalia. And Al-Shabaab, during different stages of their existence, which has been really since 20 years now, they have been incredibly active in northeastern Kenya. And they go and they sometimes preach in mosques, they kill people, they try to convert people. There's a whole brigade of Kenyans who belong to Al-Shabaab. So Al-Shabaab sees, especially the Somali territory of Kenya, where there's lots of ethnic Somalis, they see it as being something that belongs to them. And so that's why, like, for example, the Cuban doctors, because Al-Shabaab is so active there, it can kidnap people and create all sorts of trouble in that part of the country. The Kenyan military has got better at dealing with Al-Shabaab in Kenya, but in the last couple of years, it seems to have kind of slightly lost the plot on that, because Al-Shabaab has become more active there again. And then once you get into southern Somalia, that is really, a lot of that territory is Al-Shabaab's, and their headquarters is in a place called Jilib, which is where, in fact, the Al-Shabaab says the Cuban doctors were killed by Americans. So you do have whole regions, areas, and some towns that are completely controlled by al-Shabaab and have been controlled by them for a very long time. So the whole population, Somalis usually get married very young, they have children very young. So you're going to have kind of a generation of people who've been born and brought up under al-Shabaab. They don't know anything different. They think that's normal life. And so even though now there's a government offensive trying to chase them out, it's going to be incredibly difficult to do so, because al-Shabaab, they've created a culture, a form of politics, an economy that in some ways works more effectively than that of the Somali state. So to kind of uproot them permanently is going to be very, very difficult.
Well, when I was young and in Cuba, we learned about the history of this part of Africa. I remember that they made references, the books that we read made reference to the dream of a great Somalia, that the idea was that the war in the Ogaden region was part of an idea that include, they used to say, part of Kenya and part of Ethiopia. To what point the idea of al-Shabaab is motivated by the Al-Qaeda dream of a world caliphate, and to what point is this type of new nationalist expansionism that think about expanding the border of a national state that is not something typical of the dreams of the world caliphate?
Yes, I mean, you've had different iterations of al-Shabaab, and you've sometimes had the groups actually violently fighting with each other, because you've had some leaders of al-Shabaab who believe that there should be a global caliphate. I mean, one of the emirs, the leaders, he said that they had to take the caliphate all the way to Alaska. So yes, he was very much a globalist. And then you have others who are more nationalist in their thinking. So there's quite often these big rows that go on between them. At the moment, it's more the nationalists who they've got the upper hand in terms of ideology. But for them, they do believe in this thing called the Greater Somalia. And if you look at the Somali flag, it has a 5-pointed star on it. And for them, that means the part of Kenya that is eastern, with the border with Somalia, Western Ethiopia, like you spoke, the Ogaden, which is also populated by ethnic Somalis, Djibouti, which was a French colony, and that also has got a very big Somali population. Then Somaliland, which was a British protectorate, then became part of Somalia, but then broke away again, and Somalia. So if you draw on the map, the part of the Horn of Africa that is filled with Somalis, it's huge, and it goes far beyond the country that's now known as Somalia, with the blue flag and the white star on it. And that is what not just al-Shabaab, but many, many Somalis still believe in, the Greater Somalia, or Somaliwayne is how they call it in the Somali language. So that's a very, very active and alive dream for Somalis, even though they're so kind of concerned with their internal problems that it's difficult for them to ever even sort of, beyond a dream, it isn't much more than that, at least at the moment.
Well, on the issue of the Cubans, I first would like to ask you about this idea that I have seen only one reference. By the way, your book, I recommended to the audience. The title of the book, you can look for Mary Harper, and the title is Everything You Told Me Is True, The Many Faces of Al-Shabaab. You can find it in English. I don't know if it has been translated to Spanish, Mary, no. Yeah. But it's a book that I recommended, and some of the questions that I'm asking, for instance, this question on nationalism versus Islamic identity, is something that Mary covered very extensively and deeply in the book. Mary, I found that there are a couple of news reports that made reference to this position by a speaker for Al-Shabaab that mentioned Cuba as an enemy, particularly because of this issue, because they say that helped the Crusaders in Ethiopia to stop the idea of the unification of all Somalis, and made a reference to something that happened 1978. To what point, when I find only two references, I begin to question how important, after reading your book, how important is that somebody make a reference like that. Now, I think it's more than 30 years or almost 30 years after. To what point can we take this to the bank, assuming that it is real, that there is a hostility, a particular hostility against Cuba that is reflected in the kidnapping of the doctors, or this is a rare references that it should not be taken as serious as in some people seems to be?
I think that there's definitely some significance in that sort of justification, because number one, it's true, like Somalia used to be supported by the Soviet Union and its allies. And then during that war that you talked about in Ethiopia in the 70s, the Soviets and their allies, they literally overnight swapped sides. And America then became Somalia's supporter, but it was a disaster for the Somalis, and they were doing very, very well in their war against Ethiopia. But once they'd lost the Soviet support, they were really, really in trouble. And Somalis don't forget that, because to this day, enemy number one for Somalis is Ethiopia, especially for Al-Shabaab. So anybody who is seen as having supported Ethiopia during the Ogaden War or at any other time is seen as not necessarily an enemy, but there's a bitter past. One thing that Al-Shabaab does is, I speak to them a lot, and they always kind of, when you ask them, how can you kidnap a whole bunch of Kenyan teachers or seize them from a bus and kill them all, that they always have these kind of ways of justifying killings by saying that these people are legitimate targets, and you sometimes feel that they've kind of made it up after the event. Like with the Kenyans, they say, oh, these Kenyan people, they elected their government, and their government decided to send Kenyan troops into Somalia to fight us, and therefore it's those Kenyan people's fault because they elected the government. So they always have this kind of strange logic. So I don't know, when they kidnapped the Cubans, whether they even knew they were Cubans, but they would have found that sort of way of justifying their action. It is something that it sounds very familiar to me, because it fits in with their narrative about hating Ethiopia, hating Christians, and all of that. But in terms of, I doubt that Al-Shabaab would have been like, okay, we're gonna kidnap these people because they come from a country that at some stage supported Ethiopia. I can imagine they would have used that as a justification afterwards rather than before. And also, Al-Shabaab doesn't kidnap people very often. It's really very rare for them to do that. So that's another question, I suppose, that needs to be asked. What did they want by kidnapping these people? Did they want money? Were they doing it to get media attention? It is difficult to know. But definitely they see anyone who's a Westerner or a Christian or who's allied with those kind of groups in the world, they are a legitimate enemy in their eyes.
Very interesting. Let's talk a little about the link between Al-Shabaab and Al-Qaeda. There were two things that in your book I found interesting, is the idea that they provide a kind of order and even some kind of services that typically would not be associated with a clandestine group, but with a kind of semi-state there. Even it come to me the image of Hamas. That is, some people has talked about that Hamas provide medical services. They provide some kind of even a school for kids. And I would like that if you can explain to us first, what is the tie with Al-Qaeda and what are the characteristics that will make Al-Shabaab an organization that go beyond the terrorist dimension?
Yeah, it's interesting. The Al-Qaeda element, initially, Al-Shabaab was kind of wooing or courting Al-Qaeda, saying that it was affiliated, that it loved Al-Qaeda, but Al-Qaeda didn't really respond. It didn't tell them to go away, but it wasn't like warm and in love with Al-Shabaab. And then at some stage, Al-Qaeda, they started to really connect with Al-Shabaab, and they'd give speeches about the lions in Somalia and all of this, about how Al-Shabaab was basically a kind of an official affiliate of Al-Qaeda, but that the relationship, it took quite a long time to develop. And now that kind of Al-Qaeda Central, as it's known, is kind of being withered away, like I said before, Al-Shabaab is quite often described as the most successful Al-Qaeda affiliate because it's been in existence for so long. It's controlled so much territory, and also, like you said, it has Al-Shabaab itself has said to me, "Oh, we're like a shadow government. In fact, we are the government." And given that the Somali state has fell apart in the early 1990s and is still not fully rebuilt, Al-Shabaab does provide efficiently, quite similar to Hamas, certain services. It has schools, it has discipline. I even know Somalis from Kenya who've sent their families to live in Al-Shabaab areas because they say, as long as you abide by their rules, it's more predictable, it's safer. Al-Shabaab has a very effective justice system, and they even have like mobile courts that go near places like Mogadishu that are officially under the control of the government, and people who live in so-called government-controlled areas will go and use Al-Shabaab courts because they're more effective, they're not corrupt, and they make decisions, and those decisions are abided by, partly because if you don't obey an Al-Shabaab court decision, you are going to be punished with some form of violence. So there's fear, but it does enable some form of justice to exist. And also Al-Shabaab's financial system is incredibly sophisticated and effective, and they tax people all over the country. I've even seen people in the UK, Somalis in the UK, have shown me like receipts that they've been sent by Al-Shabaab because Al-Shabaab is taxing them even in the UK. So they do have an efficient system of collecting taxes from people, including in places like Mogadishu, which they don't officially control, even though they attack targets there and they have a presence. So absolutely, given that they've been in existence for nearly 20 years, they do have a government structure that it is much more durable than the sort of official Somali government structure that changes every few years when there's an election, and quite often is so restricted in what it can do because it can't move around, because it's a target of Al-Shabaab and other groups. So I think it's much more useful to think of Al-Shabaab as some form of governing system. They're not just militias going around spreading terror. They have got a system, an orderly system that they have imposed, created, and that has been relatively successful, even though I must say in the last few years there's been a very big offensive against them, which is a kind of unification of local militias, the Somali army, special Somali forces trained by the Americans, the Turks, the Emiratis, American air power, Turkish air power, an assortment of different African troops coming from different African countries. And they've been quite coordinated this time in trying to get rid of al-Shabaab. And that's been more effective than some of the other efforts to get rid of al-Shabaab. But it isn't an easy process. And I wouldn't predict that al-Shabaab will be gone anytime soon.
Just a question based on that. When some people want to criticize the Cuban government, they have talked about the international context of the Cuban government in the Islamic world. And they talk about that Cuba has contacts with the Palestinian cause, with other Arab countries. And they ask why Cuba has not contact, for instance, the Islamic Republic of Iran to mediate or to ask them to mediate for the release of the doctors. Which are the main international contacts of al-Shabaab, and what do you think about this criticism?
I mean, number one, it would be very difficult, for example, Iran, because they are Shia Muslims and al-Shabaab are Sunni, and there's an enormous amount of hatred between the two. So there would be very little that somewhere like Iran could be able to be involved in any kind of negotiation. And I can't really think of any foreign power, except perhaps the Qataris, because a bit like with Afghanistan and the Taliban, the Qataris have got some people say they've got some sort of, not relationship, but there's some communication between the Qataris and certain people in the Somali government and al-Shabaab. And if I was going to choose any foreign power to negotiate or try to bring about any kind of communications or negotiated settlement, it would be the Qataris. I can't see any other country being effective. And even the Qataris, like with something like negotiating over the Cuban hostages, I doubt that they would have been of much help, because al-Shabaab is really, even though they have these affiliations with al-Qaeda groups, they are pretty much like a lone wolf operator. They have their own rules. Somalis have their own way of doing things, whether they're al-Shabaab or not. And like you did mention about the Somalis in Minnesota, they are very, very proud people, and they're often quite hostile to any foreigner. So in terms of negotiating about the doctors, the most, I would have said, the most kind of hopeful approach would have been to do it through local elders, through Somalis, not through foreign powers.
Well, two things on that, on your mention of Minnesota. Recently, Ilhan Omar, a member of Congress from the Somali community, she went to Cuba, and she has been quite clear in support of the idea of ending the U.S. embargo on Cuba. And it's something that I noticed when I was living there. I tend to favor this type of policy from the United States toward Cuba, that of ending the sanctions. And I noticed that among them, when I mentioned the time that there used to be even Somalis that went to study in Cuba, most of them agree with the idea that the embargo must end. That was something that for me was, when I was thinking about was a reason to doubt about this idea that the Somalis has very much in their heart the idea that Cuba played a very negative role in their history, and that they will hold this resentment after 30 years, when it was in the case of Cuba, the work with Ethiopia was in the Ogaden territory, not like the Ethiopian invasion in the 2000s. I think that people obviously can make their history clear on that. So let me ask you about specifically on this case. By the way, very enlightening also the explanation about the international factors and how to negotiate. Was there any cost for Al-Shabaab of going to this province that is a very difficult province in Kenya and take the doctors from a community that was benefiting from them? Because it's obviously one of the things that has been told to us a lot is that this is an area in which not many doctors were ready to go and work, and suddenly Al-Shabaab go and take those doctors from the community and bring them to the, I think it's called GLIP, no? GLIP or Chile.
GLIP, yeah, GLIP.
Sorry, I have a big cold.
Sorry.
And the idea is that it was there something that the community will take it as wrong, or it's part of the political dynamic there between southern Somalia and northern Kenya.
I mean, because that part of Kenya where the doctors were seized from is a Somali dominated area, ethnic Somali. I mean, of course, not all Somalis support Al-Shabaab, and I'm sure in that region it would be a minority of Somalis who support Al-Shabaab. So I would imagine that the majority of the people living there would have been appalled by what happened. But at the same time, that part of Kenya, I mean, in some ways, it's very marginalized by the rest of Kenya. That even though there's lots and lots of Somali Kenyans, they are not treated very well by the other Kenyans. There's quite a lot of hostility towards them and prejudice against them and fear, actually, of them. So in terms of, I mean, the Cubans, to go and work in that part of Kenya, you have to be pretty brave because it is unstable, unpredictable, and Al-Shabaab and other sort of groups of bandits operate there. So it's not a very safe place. So they were admirably brave. It's also a very, very deprived place. So obviously anyone who will go there and work in health or other much needed sectors like education, they will be tremendously valuable. But I would say that I wouldn't say that the majority of the population there would have supported them being kidnapped. I'm sure that even though as Somalis they might see, like they see so many foreigners as sort of people to be despised, they would have also appreciated hugely the fact that they were providing health services in a place where it's so difficult to get any kind of medical education, medical attention or education or other kinds of resources, even water.
Well, there have been also other kidnappings by Al-Shabaab, and some people has made references to the solution of the kidnapping of an Italian nun that ended. I think she converted to Islam after that. People have said, or some people that particularly want to be critical of the Cuban government, they criticize that the Cuban government didn't pay the ransom or that they tried to find a solution. I have been searching and I didn't find any particular references of a price tag in the case of the Cuban doctors. And perhaps it comes to my mind that there might be an attempt to use
two Cuban doctors have been
as
working
doctors and not necessarily to exchange them for a ransom. That's something that I couldn't find. Perhaps the negotiation with the elders this program has no link, no tie with the Cuban government, but try to be as objective as possible. And one of the reasons that I wanted to ask you these questions is because I noticed that has been your trajectory. Is there the possibility that these people were kidnapped as part of this network of services that Al-Shabaab tried to give to the population, and not that they were negotiating a ransom for them?
Absolutely. I mean, you've introduced a very interesting and important element into this conversation, because unlike, let's say, the piracy off the coast of Somalia, that was very clearly for ransom. And there was always a price and there was negotiation. And if you paid the money, the ship and the crew would be released. With Al-Shabaab, like I said, it's not very frequent that they kidnap people. And in terms of ransom demands, they're very opaque. And I don't even know whether they would have issued ransom demands officially. And like you say, they desperately need qualified medical professionals. And it makes more sense in a way for them to have wanted those doctors to provide medical services, and the fact that they took them to their headquarters where you might have some quite senior Al-Shabaab people needing medical treatment, because they do get injured a lot, either in drone strikes or in fighting. Those Cuban doctors might have been more valuable sort of staying there than if they'd been released for a few $1 million, because also Al-Shabaab, because it's so effective at collecting money, like it's said by a Somali think tank, for example, that Al-Shabaab collects more taxes than the Somali government. Wow. So they, in terms of financing, they don't really struggle that much. And that might be a reason why they don't kidnap people that often. So, I mean, that theory, I don't know whether it's true, but in some ways it would make perfect sense for them to have wanted them, because they had skills that were lacking in Al-Shabaab areas. That argument has got quite a sensible logic to it, and I would not discount it by any means.
Well, I think that we are getting short of time, and you have been quite patient with my questions.
It's fine.
Again, I'm sorry for the state of my voice, but there is a question that I have to ask, because it touched the hope, and there are a lot of people in Cuba that they have been praying, they have been hoping that the two doctors would be released. There was even a case of a Cuban officer who fought in the Ogaden War that was released almost 20 years after, or 12, 15 years after the war in the Ogaden. He was captured by the Somali army at that time. And there was the idea that someday they will come back to the island. There is a lot of respect for Cuban doctors and these global health missions. And I don't know if you have found the same situation, because I know that you travel beyond Somalia, and there has been Cuba. One of my cousins was in Uganda, another in Ethiopia. The same person, she was a doctor and was in both places, in Angola and many other places. And the main source about the death of the doctor was a communique or a message in Instagram by a kind of a speaker for Al-Shabaab. How serious do you think? First, it's very interesting, the use of electronic and the digital media. It's something that I found very interesting. But how probable or or serious would you take a communique that said that they were killed and that they were killed by an attack with drones supported by the United States? I found this also very convenient to say that was the United States that killed them. And but I would like to go to your expertise. People mention a lot that you are one of the persons that has had more communication with people from Al-Shabaab. I know that I has put you in a hard place, but if I don't ask you this question, I will not be doing my part. How serious is when the speaker for Al-Shabaab go to Instagram and say that the two doctors were killed there? They put a picture and they blame it on a U.S. drone attack.
Yeah, this is a very complicated question and issue. In terms of Al-Shabaab using sophisticated forms of social media and technology, that has been a hallmark of the group. They make incredibly sophisticated propaganda videos. They're very, very smart when it comes to the use of social media to spread their belief systems, to spread their claims. They're really, really good at that. They are very media savvy. So that doesn't surprise me that they release the information like that. That is what Al-Shabaab does. Another thing that I've noticed with Al-Shabaab is that they don't lie very often when they make claims. Like sometimes, I'd call them and say, did you carry out this attack? And sometimes they say, oh, I don't know. Let me check with the people in that area. And then they come back to me and say, yes, actually, it was us. Or they'd say, no, it wasn't. And usually they would turn out to be correct. Of course, the sort of perfect argument for them would be that it was the Americans, because it makes America look awful. And it is true that America has recently been conducting a lot of airstrikes against Al-Shabaab, and they are very effective. And Jilib is a place they would want to hit because it's Al-Shabaab's headquarters. Al-Shabaab saying that the Cubans were killed by the strike, it is convenient to say that for their propaganda, but I would say it's impossible to confirm or deny that. But I definitely wouldn't say it's impossible, because the Americans, they have killed civilians in airstrikes, and sometimes they deny it, and then eventually either there'll be a big investigation or they might occasionally acknowledge that they've done that. So it's not beyond the realms of possibility that that's what happened. But I would imagine that we will never know the truth about that. I mean, you'd also wonder, why would Al-Shabaab decide to kill those doctors at that time? Like, those doctors would have been very useful to them, providing services, or maybe one day being released in return for money if Al-Shabaab needed money. Like, why would they kill the Cubans? Unless they said, well, we've killed them because they supported Ethiopia all those years ago.
Or they tried to escape.
Or they tried to escape. That's another possibility. So I think that's a question that we'll never know the answer to. I mean, it does seem, if the US are going to bomb Jilib, often they don't bomb towns because there's too much risk of civilian collateral killings. They prefer to strike more once they've got intelligence of Al-Shabaab leadership being somewhere out in more rural areas. But it's not completely impossible that they did that. But I can't give you a definitive answer, because both sides have certain logics to them. And I haven't spoken to Al-Shabaab personally about this particular issue.
Well, this has been a very interesting conversation with Mary Harper, Africa editor of the BBC. We thank you very much, Mary, for the time that you have dedicated to us. As you understand, this is an issue that we found that you were the right person to knock at your door. And, we appreciate a lot your time and contribution to this conversation. So thank you.
And I hope you feel better soon.
Thank
Take
you.
care. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bueno, ya vieron, ese fue el programa. Nosotros lo vamos a poner por separado. Queremos que esté allí también en su versión en inglés para que las personas que lo quieran ver lo puedan ver. Estoy esperando, me parece que ustedes me escuchan. Me imagino que ustedes me están escuchando bien. Si pueden, díganmelo ahí porque hemos estado, ¿cómo decir? Viajando sin saber el feedback. Hemos visto algunos de los comentarios que se han puesto ahí. No hay muchas dudas. Nos preguntaron por el título del libro. El libro que yo leí, ella tiene 2 libros. Uno se llama Getting Somalia Wrong, que quiere decir aprendiendo mal sobre Somalia, más o menos, la traducción. Y no, Jagüita, estamos en vivo nosotros, pero nosotros habíamos grabado la entrevista el miércoles con Mary Harper. Ella estaba en Londres y nosotros estábamos aquí. Qué bueno que se escuchó bien. Nos dice el Mambía Anónimo y está el gran amigo Duarte, con el cual a veces hemos tratado de comunicarnos y nos cuesta trabajo. Si puedes, Duarte, llámame y conversamos. Entonces, yo creo que los comentarios que voy a hacer son breves, salvo que alguien quiera entrar y decir algo, o me voy a referir básicamente a los comentarios que hay algún que otro de los comentarios que hay en el chat. Bueno, el primer libro de ella se llama Aprendiendo a Somalia Incorrecto, puse el StreamYard por si alguien fuese a subir. Y en yo no lo he leído la introducción y básicamente ella trata, después de pasar muchos años de periodista en Mogadiscio, que es la capital de Somalia, hacer la historia, cómo Somalia no fue un estado fallido siempre, al contrario, fue un estado muy, muy viable, había mucho turismo hacia Somalia, muchas playas, es un área muy, muy turística, muy atractiva. Hubo una época incluso que tenía gran número de turistas europeos, a pesar de la orientación pro campo comunista que tenía el régimen de Mohamed Siad Barre. Ella explica también todo el tema de la hambruna, el desastre natural y algunas de esas cosas, pero yo no he podido leer el libro. Lo que he leído es reseñas sobre ese libro. El libro que ella escribió, que yo sí me leí por el interés que tenía en el tema de los médicos cubanos y que lo voy a compartir con los miembros del canal, se llama Todo lo que me has dicho es verdad. Entre puntos, las muchas caras de Al-Shabaab. Entonces ahí ella explica la organización, cómo la organización se afilió con Al-Qaeda. Ahí yo, por ejemplo, me quedó claro que si esto empieza a ganar la fuerza que tiene a partir de 2006, las personas que estaban diciendo que vieron la película Black Hawk Down y que es la caída del halcón negro, que es sobre un grupo de militares norteamericanos que fueron cercados después de una operación militar contra el líder Mohamed Farah Aidid, que era un general de la guerra civil somalí y que era como parte de acompañamiento militar a una misión humanitaria. Habría que ver, por ejemplo, son referencias a tomar ahora cuando se habla de Haití, Pues está hablando que va a haber otra misión humanitaria, por cierto, con un papel importante para Kenya. Y bueno, ella explica toda la historia de la guerra civil somalí, la intervención etíope, ese tipo de cosas. Y bueno, de dónde sale Al-Shabaab como una radicalización de un grupo que se llamaba la Unión de Cortes Islámicas. Eso a mí me parece es un libro muy interesante a leer. Está considerado como la Biblia en estudios sobre este grupo que se llama Al-Shabaab y las analogías estas que pudimos construir en la conversación sobre cómo ellos, como Hamas, compaginan y Hezbollah compaginan la actividad terrorista con una especie de semi-estado con administrando sistemas de salud, educación, vínculo particularmente que se da en la cultura islámica por la unión entre la religión y el Estado. Han habido otros comentarios sobre opiniones que han dado otras personas que puede no coincidan con la opinión de Mary Harper. Yo no voy a caer en el juego de decir, andar criticando a otras personas. No es mi estilo. Yo busco el espacio. Aquí llega el Mambí cubano. Hola Mambí, ¿cómo está? No sé si me escuchas bien, pero si no voy a...
Arturo,
Qué gusto.
no, el gusto es mío, si te oyes mal, vas a tener que tomar un poco de miel o algo porque de oírte nada más a uno mismo le duele
Ah, bueno, no,
en la boca rasposa.
me duele la garganta un poco y eso, pero bueno, quise hacer el programa porque llevaba ya una semana, casi más, un poquitico más, sin hacer el programa y había hecho esta entrevista y no quería que se envejeciera. Pero déjame terminar un momentico y ya te doy la palabra. Estaba diciendo que hay alguna gente que ha dicho que bueno, que si en el programa de Morales, que en el programa de Cao, que en el programa de Pentón, se han dado opiniones diferentes a las que dice Mary Harper aquí. Yo, obviamente, escogí a quien yo considero experto, pero yo no me voy a dedicar a criticar ni a negar las opiniones de otras personas. Más, yo no me ocupo, yo no sé ni si las personas que han dicho que ellos dijeron esas cosas están en lo correcto, porque eso puede ocurrir. En última instancia, cada cual esto se informa, aprende donde uno quiere. A mí, si yo quiero estudiar historia de Cuba, yo voy a un buen libro de historia de Cuba. Yo no voy a preguntarle a cualquiera que esté en la calle vendiendo un mango si me puede contar la historia de José Martí. Y entonces es así, ese es mi procedimiento. Si alguien quiere cuestionar ese procedimiento, bueno, está bien. Tú puedes criticar. Hay una visión antiintelectualista que yo sé que prolifera mucho en el contexto trompista, en el contexto de la derecha cubana americana. Hicimos hasta un programa aquí donde mencionamos cómo se había visto lo de Céspedes, lo de la Fernandina, etcétera. Ahora este es otro tema que es específico, tiene conocimiento. Esta señora ha vivido 30, 40 años, 30 años, dice que estaba ya desde el año 94 en Somalia, es la corresponsal, la editora para África de la BBC. Entonces yo eh, hice todo lo posible. Después de leerme su libro, de invitarla, ella vio mi resumen, decidió conversar conmigo y ya ahí está. Si usted quiere ir y contrastarlo con otras personas y usted cree que lo que le dicen otras personas tiene más sentido sobre una película que sobre si dice ella que que Al-Shabaab no promueve la piratería, que es una organización diferente, por lo cual ella dice que alaba la película Captain Phillips, pero dice que no es una buena guía para entender a Al-Shabaab, es buena guía para entender a los piratas. Coincide que es en el territorio de Somalia, pero ya yo me había fijado que geográficamente operan en diferentes áreas. Y sí, yo creo que sí se dio ese pedido de, de Pentón de que Cuba hablara con Irán, que era islámico, para que hablara con Al-Shabaab, Y a mí enseguida se me encendió los faroles, porque no puede ser que la diferencia entre chiita y sunita, que todo el que sabe algo elemental del Medio Oriente sabe que cuenta mucho, y esto, en ese caso, ella misma dijo que a ella le parecía que había pocos espacios internacionales donde Cuba podía hablar con esas personas para que ejercieran presión sobre Al-Shabaab, porque Al-Shabaab no tiene esos grandes contactos internacionales, y mucho menos la República Islámica de Irán, como sugirió Pentón. ¿Quién está en lo correcto? Yo apostaría que es ella. Pero bueno, usted también tiene. Yo no vengo aquí ahora a dedicarme a echarle a otra persona. Aquí lo más importante es esclarecer, conocer, adquirir conocimiento para poder jugar por nuestra propia cabeza, con conocimiento, con respeto por lo que es la ciencia social en general. Eso lleva tiempo, estudio, visitar el lugar, conocer. Ella es sindicada como una de las personas que hasta ha tenido comunicaciones con Al-Shabaab. Entonces, bueno, por ahí queda. A mí me resultó bien fuerte la última parte cuando ella dijo eso de que ellos no tienden a decir muchas mentiras en sus comunicados. Y bueno, habría que ver hasta qué punto ellos, cuando dijeron esto de que en los medios, o sea, que ella no le ve sentido a que ellos digan que los médicos están muertos si ellos estuvieran vivos, pero dice que admite que es posible este tema de que puede que hayan muerto de otra manera, pero que nosotros a la larga será muy difícil saber, lo cual también nos ilustra, y quiero decirlo a todos, es que uno no puede hablar cuando uno encuentra una experta como ella, que deja tanta duda en el análisis, también uno se pregunta cómo alguien que está en Miami o en Camagüey o en cualquier otro lugar o en Madrid pueda llegar y hablar con toda la seguridad de que él sí sabe lo que pasó, y te lo digo con una certeza de 100, 120%. Entonces, parte de lo que este programa trata de hacer es cultivar esa actitud de ser menos soberbio y ser más respetuoso por la ciencia, por adoptar en una esfera política, una esfera pública donde predomine ese tipo de duda, porque cuando usted está tan seguro de todo, posiblemente, digamos que también en todas sus convicciones es muy difícil, y convierte en convicciones, cosas que son elementos factuales, donde la duda se impone, es muy difícil dialogar con usted. Finalmente, había algo más que yo quería decir, que ella, nótese lo que ella dice con respecto a la crítica que se le hace. Ella no dice, no hace la crítica, pero a mí es algo que le quería preguntar. Dice alguien aquí que se llama Gerro 2, dice saludos a todos, al profesor, a Eva y al visitante. Lo otro que quiero decir aquí es que ella no se compra el método ese que han usado otras personas, de que Al-Shabaab había secuestrado a la monja italiana y pidió $1 millón por ella, y que alguien dio los $1 millones y a ella la liberaron. La señora se convirtió al Islam incluso, y que la liberaron por $1 millón. En el caso de los médicos cubanos, yo le hago la insinuación a partir de leer su propio libro. Si usted dice que Al-Shabaab ha montado un semiestado que trata de insertarse en las poblaciones, dando servicios, es posible que hayan secuestrado a los médicos cubanos. Y si usted dice que ellos no secuestran a tanta gente, que esto lo hayan hecho específico para ponerlos a dar servicios médicos en la zona donde ellos están, para sus combatientes, para la población, etcétera. Y la respuesta de ella es absolutamente, absolutely. Y dice que ella cree que eso es más probable. Entonces, yo creo que algún día el gobierno cubano tiene que explicar todo lo que ha hecho para haber salvado a esos médicos, todo lo que hizo. Pero obviamente hay toda una crítica de gente que le ha entrado a esto con una respuesta en busca de la pregunta. La respuesta es: el gobierno cubano los dejó abandonados, según ellos. Entonces ellos vienen a buscar la pregunta, y entonces en esa pregunta inventan cosas que las personas que son expertas, que no tienen nada que ver con Cuba, porque ella es la editora de África de la BBC, y te dicen, bueno, mira, yo pondría una duda sobre eso, porque hay estas condiciones que se plantean ahí. Yo no estoy ni eximiendo ni condenando al gobierno cubano, pero creo que las personas que se lanzan corriendo a la condena sin hacer la tarea deben por lo menos tener un tiempito y darle un espacio a la duda en este sentido. Yo creo que este ha sido el programa. Yo no llamo a extraer mis propias conclusiones, pero he reflexionado con ustedes de otra manera. Yo quería un momentico, antes de darle la palabra al Mambí, compartir un momento el programa donde salieron los dos médicos, Landy y Yaciel, y para que se vea cómo ellos se expresan ahí en este tema de que están en una región. Por cierto, muy interesante que Mary Harper dijo esto mismo, de que ellos son médicos, los médicos cubanos son muy respetados a partir de estar en una zona remota, difícil, etcétera. Se voy a ver si le puedo poner los videos que yo veo aquí. El primero es un artículo que sale en la prensa keniana a la llegada de los médicos cubanos. Esto en el StreamYard, a ver si lo pongo ahora. Aquí está. Y voy a ir ahí para que ustedes vean el titular. Dice: Cuban doctors arrive in Kenya. Y bueno, son recibidos por varios gobernadores, entre ellos este que es el de otra provincia que se llama Kisumu, y que se dice que eran 50 de 100 que aterrizaron en el aeropuerto Jomo Kenyatta, el aeropuerto internacional en Nairobi, y que fueron desplegados en los 47 distritos del lugar, y aquí ustedes los ven. Ahí están. Yo no me atrevo a tratar de identificar los dos que fueron secuestrados, pero yo creo que es interesante, bueno, recordar que ellos fueron recibidos con mucho cariño por las autoridades, las opiniones del pueblo, etcétera, kenyano, y que incluía a varios especialistas, entre ellos 5 nefrólogos, 3 radiólogos, y 3 cirujanos ortopédicos, neurólogos y cirujanos plásticos. Bueno, ahí está toda la información, que van a estar, como que van a estar allí y todo esto, y que van a trabajar también con especialistas en salud kenianos. Creo que esto es importante a ponerlo en el contexto. Y la otra cosa que quería compartir es este video, que es donde salen ellos hablando, y ellos hablan de que están en esta parte que es un área peligrosa, pero que ellos creen que tiene la protección del pueblo. Así que vamos a ponerlo.
In Mandera County, bringing relief to patients who have had to cope with harsh times after medics fled the area for fear of terror attacks. The two have overcome their insecurity fears and are settling in well with residents while learning the language and way of life. Hassan Mugambi has just returned from Mandera County and now brings us their story.
The Mandera Referral Hospital. General practitioner Dr. Herrera Correa and Sergeant Landy Rodriguez are back to work after a short lunch break. Ready for their afternoon appointment with their patients. Correa sees 20 patients per day in his 8-hour shift, while Rodriguez handles about 10 surgical procedures daily.
Exam, CT scan,
But they are on call 24 hours a day, adapting to a new environment that offered nothing more than anxiety when they learned they were deployed here.
My reaction was bad because when I checking internet of Mandera County, internet said Mandera County is a dangerous country for people for attack Al-Shabaab. Al-Shabaab people attack in Mandera counties.
It was not much of a shock for Dr. Correa, though.
I have also good experience working in several countries, the Venezuela and Brazil, in very hard conditions.
The presence of the duo bringing relief in an area where medical workers left in droves due to the threat posed by Al-Shabaab.
Such a delicate procedure, we have to do a surgeon with a medical officer. I think they have helped us.
Deka Hassan is one such patient. A resident of Bulahawa, a small village across the border in Somalia, Deka was referred to Mandera after her pregnancy developed in an incisional hernia after her first delivery.
Okay, she said she was done cesarean section 5 years ago. After 3 days of the normal stay in the hospital, she went back to Somalia. Then after staying there, she developed complication because of the insecurities and lack of good health facilities. She didn't seek for medical attention.
The uterus where the baby is in was out of the stomach. It's just outside the skin. So you see, at such a delicate procedure, we have to do a surgeon with a medical officer.
For remove the baby, in this moment the baby is very, very, very good, and the lady is good too.
Deka's next appointment with Rodriguez comes in 4 months, where he will perform another surgery to correct the hernia. Apart from their experience at the hospital, the doctors say they have already started learning Swahili and Somali languages.
Good thing and a bad thing, but I don't say you the bad things. Askari, policeman, pole pole, slowly. Yes. Ahuna matata.
In Cuba, didn't eat a camel.
But here you do.
Yeah, here, yes.
The language barrier, however, remains the greatest challenge in their line of work.
This area, people, even English and Swahili is a big problem. Most of the community who live around here, they speak in Somali.
The advantage we have with that surgeon is twofold. One, he's a local, he's come back. Secondly, he speaks fluent Spanish.
Even as some doctors fled Mandera on counts that it was too insecure for them to operate, there are those that have crossed seas just to be here. Of interest is service to the local population will always call Mandera home despite the security challenges. Hassan Mugambi, Citizen TV, Mandera County.
Bueno, ya viste Mambí, ya viste el programa, ya que no sé si querías decir algo. Disculpa que te subí y te hice esperar un poco, pero estas cosas quería ponerlas en el contexto.
Sí, no. Muy breve, porque es verdad que ha durado un rato esto y se siente mal uno, porque es verdad que tú suenas, que tiene la garganta candela. Interesante. Realmente es cierto, las cosas de los académicos, lo de Cao, yo no sé, cualquier tema que sea, yo sé que él lo puede dar el mismo programa sin ver mucho la noticia, porque más o menos él sabe lo que tiene que decir, por lo menos en mi opinión. Él no, eso se Cao. Y respecto a los académicos y los estudiosos de los temas, verdaderamente le pueden abrir a uno un mundo muy diferente. Uno a veces cree que sabe cuál es la realidad, incluso la propia realidad con la que uno se está más familiarizado. Imagínate tú, un lugar remoto más todavía, que uno realmente nunca ha estado allí, ni ha tenido ni siquiera testimonios indirectos de gente que es cercana a uno hablando de esos lugares. Entonces, verdaderamente, hace poco vi una presentación, por ejemplo, de una cubana que está radicada en Estados Unidos como académica, hablando de una investigación que hizo, para darte una idea de cómo las cosas pueden ser muy diferentes a lo que uno se imagina, que en este caso sería algo por el estilo, de unos enterramientos que hubo aquí en la costa, en lo que es ahora el Vedado, y que tienen que ver con el racismo científico y con el trato de de cuestiones del pasado relativamente remoto de Cuba y que uno no asocia el vedado, por ejemplo, con enterramiento, ni uno asocia, por ejemplo, lo que es ahora la Terminal de Trenes de La Habana, con que ahí había un jardín botánico. Sí, de lo más interesante, porque verdad que te pone a pensar, te hace la comparación del trato que se le dio a los restos mortales de Panchito Gómez Toro comparado con Antonio Maceo, pues, aparentemente por cuestión racial, digamos, ¿no? Pero bueno, nada, qué bueno que tú haces estos programas, porque sí, hay que mantener el nivel, porque si vamos a tener que depender de Caos, que yo, para mí es Caos, y de este otro Pentón y ese tipo de personajes, para no hablar de los demás, por suerte no, por suerte tú tienes otro estándar, y nada, qué bueno.
No, pero fíjate que yo ni siquiera he dicho
desde aquí te seguimos,
hay que hablar.
y lo que diga la última vez mantengo. Lo que pasa es que tú sabes, en Cuba muchas cosas son impredecibles.
Acuérdate que si quieres mandarnos una cápsula de cosas que ves en Cuba, mándanos, con gusto la reproducimos. Y te repito, más que todo, aquí
lo voy a hacer, nada más te voy a decir.
Sí. Dime, te escucho.
Sí, no. Así como un comentario anecdótico, se me cayó un pedazo del alero. Y entonces rompió una tubería y tengo que arreglarla, mil cosas, ¿no? Pero sí, la casa está más o menos, necesita ayuda. Pero aparte de eso, nada, yo tengo una de las cápsulas, Google Drive, he tratado de hacer espacio para darte el link, porque no quiero mandártelo porque, ¿cómo decirte? Sobreusa el espacio, ¿no? Tengo que hacer espacio para meter entonces te doy el link para que tú lo puedas bajar de ahí directamente. Respecto a las cápsulas de las que hemos hablado, me he enredado haciendo eso, pero lo voy a hacer como quedamos y yo sigo en lo dicho. Y nada, gracias por todo, Arturo. Sí, así que tú sabes que tienes una audiencia fiel.
Gracias, gracias. Bueno,
seguimos.
Para esa buena audiencia hacemos esto muchas veces defendiendo la camiseta. Nos vemos entonces, Mambí. Bueno, miren, yo creo que voy a ir cerrando. Hay una pregunta muy interesante hay Ahmed que nos escribe desde Alamar en La Habana. Qué bueno que hay personas viendo el programa en Cuba. Y este sí programa es totalmente orgánico. Aquí sí no aparece nadie que no sea auténtico. Y lo otro es que aquí no se compra una vista para nada ni nada. Pero fíjense, hemos hecho un programa muy bueno y hemos recolectado $2. Nadie se ha hecho miembro. Tenemos una audiencia que viene, como dice el Mambí, con mucha asiduidad, pero no nos comparten. Así que por favor, traten de compartir el programa, hasta bájenlo, compártanlo con otras personas para hacerlo, para que esta visión también se escuche. Y bueno, hay la pregunta de R2, y que nos dice del tratamiento informacional del gobierno cubano. Mira, yo creo que este tema de los secuestros es tratado muy discrecionalmente por cualquier gobierno. El gobierno americano, el gobierno de cualquier otro país que yo he visto que hay temas de secuestro. El gobierno israelí, hay mucho respeto en Israel a través del espectro político por las gestiones del gobierno, a veces para recibir los restos de los rehenes judíos agarrados por los grupos terroristas, o incluso los soldados que han muerto en combate. Mucho respeto por los familiares, mucho respeto por la gestión del gobierno que se hace en ese sentido, por la discreción. Y yo creo que eso pasa de donde quiera. Siempre, generalmente, hay un momento, y eso yo creo que debe llegar, en el cual el gobierno, si pasara, Dios no lo quiera, pero parece que es probable que estos médicos, Dios los tenga en la gloria, si eso ocurriera, que en ese caso el gobierno naturalmente haría bien en rendir cuenta y decir todo lo que hizo por su liberación. Más allá de algunas referencias que ha habido, la presencia de Esteban Lazo en África, la declaración del ministro de Exteriores Bruno Rodríguez, yo creo que que hay que ir más allá de la confianza. Si tú me dices a mí del tratamiento informacional, ahora para eso hay su tiempo. Como se dice en la Biblia, hay un tiempo para cada cosa. Y ojalá que en algún momento de eso se hable con más. El costo político, yo creo que el costo político con las personas decentes vendría si después no se hace un informe. Pero yo creo que la persona decente, la persona que confía, que está tratando no con bandidos, y además que es difícil querer dialogar con alguien a quien tú deshumanizas al punto de que tú crees que esos 2 médicos que fueron enviados ahí no le importen a las autoridades. Yo creo que eso hay evidencia suficiente de que no ha sido así en otros casos. Así que sí, habría que compaginar la discreción en la gestión, que tiene una política informacional específica, y una vez resuelto el caso de la mejor o de la peor manera, sí creo que habría que dar las cuentas respectivas. Bueno, tenemos saludo de Ahmed desde Alamar, saludo de Julián Rodríguez del Cerro, y dice Ahmed, ¿cómo se puede hacer una donación desde Cuba y usando transfer móvil o hacerse miembro? Mira, voy a pensar, es como la tercera vez que nos hacen la pregunta. Ahmed, voy a pensar en eso y lo voy a escribir allí. Pero bueno, este ha sido Conversaciones Americanas. Amigo, tengo afectada la voz, voy a tratar de cortar el tiempo y ya llevamos casi 1 hora 40 minutos de programa. Hasta la próxima. Chao.